Hello, everyone. This is World Review with Daalder, a weekly look at news from around the world, produced by the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. It's Friday, March 15th. We start this week with looking at the mounting hunger crisis in Gaza. UN and other officials have warned for weeks that the situation for the more than 2 million people in the Gaza Strip along the Mediterranean is going from bad to worse. And this week, we saw the first cases of children dying from starvation. What can and should the international community, the United States and Israel do to help alleviate the suffering? Then we look at another mounting humanitarian crisis, this time in Haiti, where armed gangs have taken over major cities and forced the resignation of a very unpopular prime minister. How can security be reestablished? And who will muster the ability to unite a deeply fractured society? Finally, an election of sorts. Today, polls open in Russia, allowing people to vote for their next president. Only problem is the outcome is already known. Vladimir Putin will win his fifth time, extending his rule as the longest serving ruler of Russia since the October Revolution. Here to talk about these issues are three reporters that covered these stories. Yasmeen Abutaleb is the White House reporter from Washington for the Washington Post and joins us from Washington. Ravi Agrawal is the editor-in-chief of foreign policy and the host of FP Live. He joins us from New York. And finally, Giles Whittell, world affairs editor at Tortoise Media, who is in London. And I am in Houston. Good morning, all. Wonderful to see you. Great to have you all back on the show. Yasmeen, let's start with you. Gaza, the situation really is getting to a point that I think everyone now is focused on a singular fact: how to avoid hunger among the people, the 2 million plus people who are living, or at least surviving for now, in this place. Bring us up to date about why all of a sudden this has become sort of the motivating force for everything that seems to be going on.
Well, I think, Ibu, you highlighted the fact that we got the first reports this week of children dying of malnutrition, dehydration, starvation, and there were these really just horrific images of children in their final days, hours, who had starved to death that I think really just ignited sort of worldwide anger over this problem and how dire the situation has become. But I think really the incident that sparked all of this was, I think it was on February 29th, there was a delivery of an aid convoy in northern Gaza, which hadn't gotten food for several weeks. There had been pretty much no aid that had come into the northern part of Gaza, where about 300,000 people still are, for several weeks. And there was this aid delivery, a shipment of flour and some other basic goods that came in. It was publicized. When I spoke with officials in the Biden administration, they thought the IDF had publicized the delivery of this convoy, thinking it might make it safer. But anyway, people ended up in the middle of the night. It was 3 or 4 a.m. rushing this truck. It was a totally chaotic and turned deadly incident where more than 100 people ended up dying trying to get food. The White House wouldn't really weigh in on what exactly they thought happened. The Gaza Health Ministry accused Israeli forces of firing on the crowd and shooting at people indiscriminately. The Israelis said Palestinians stormed the truck and there was looting and that they felt threatened, and so they fired. When I talked to the administration, what I heard from them was maybe the details of this are murky, but they ultimately blamed Israel for creating the conditions that allowed this to happen. One official said that this was chaos of Israel's own making, because the U.S., for months now has been trying to tell Israel they need a plan for the day after in Gaza. And even though we're not quite at that day after, that you couldn't let law and order just fall apart and descend. Israel was not allowing Hamas police forces to accompany these aid trucks. So there has been no safe way to deliver aid. And also that they had created the conditions that had allowed for this kind of desperation where people are storming a truck because they are so desperate for food. And I think this incident was so horrific and was such a brutal reminder to people of just how bad the conditions have gotten inside Gaza, that it really, you saw the administration's language sharpen considerably after that. Both Biden and Vice President Kamala Harris said there were no excuses for Israel not allowing more aid in before they had sort of done this public prodding of we really want to see more aid go in, we really want to see more go in, but had not quite gotten to this place of no excuses. And since then, when I talked to administration officials, they said that tragedy allowed them to go to Israel and say, you have a serious problem here. We have been telling you, you need a plan. You're not allowing police forces to accompany you. So now there's this strange mix of families are sometimes accompanying these trucks or some sort of security force. U.S. officials aren't completely sure of what's happening, but they've just told Israel that before they can even think about another major military operation in Gaza, they have to address the humanitarian crisis because there is virtually no law and order, especially in the north. And that's just making these deliveries impossible.
Ravi, I think Yasmeen sort of describes the situation, tragic situation, really well. But it strikes me that this focus on the day after may be slightly misplaced. What it is there's no governance today. There's no law and order, as Yasmeen said, particularly in the north, but in fact throughout most of the enclave. And indeed, there can't be, because the very people who were responsible for law and order are the ones who the Israelis are trying to destroy. And so isn't there, from like day one, been an issue here that the Israelis just haven't had a strategy of how you, on the one hand, get rid of those who are governing and in control, that is Hamas, without thinking through who's going to take over?
Yeah, absolutely. This whole thing is a tragedy. There was no plan for day one. There was no plan for the day after. There was also no plan to ensure that day one wouldn't continue for 5.5 months now. I mean, we're entering a 6th month of fighting. And it was never meant to be this long with these conditions with no planning. So the whole thing is awful to see, shocking, the lack of planning. And, it's only going to get worse. I mean, famines are not supposed to take place in the modern era. We've all been talking about the number of people dead over the last few months, bad enough as that is. By all accounts now, once a famine takes hold, you are looking at generational malnutrition. You are looking at hunger that has deep, lasting impacts on a population that I don't think the world has reckoned with entirely. And I'm really glad that we're leading this discussion today with this topic, because, if you just play the trend lines through of where this is headed, even the best case scenarios are awful. And we aren't even close to being able to get to the best case scenarios. So a lot of things need to happen to, I won't say reverse, but to change the trajectory of the worst case scenarios that are playing out. And it begins with a ceasefire. What we're looking at here is a complete collapse of the infrastructure of Gaza, of the running of the place, of the healthcare infrastructure, of the delivery of food and aid and water. And when you break all of these things down, this is what you get. I mean, so this should not be surprising. I mean, I think there are many people who could have predicted we would be at this point were the conflict to last as long as it has. It's quite natural. When you cut things off, you run out of food and water. When you attack hospitals and healthcare centers, you run out of ways to take care of people. I mean, this is all fairly obvious stuff. So if we were to think about how to fix this, it has to begin with a ceasefire. It has to begin as well with America being able to not just talk about what needs to be done. Yasmeen, I think, very accurately pointed out a shift in rhetoric from the White House. But I think it needs to be much more than rhetoric at this stage as well. I think the United States needs to use more of the leverage it so clearly has when it comes to Israel. The question is how to impose that leverage in a way that shifts the course of what we're seeing in terms of the humanitarian crisis, in terms of a longer-term plan, in terms of the hostage negotiations, in terms of finally a two-state solution, which, as we all know, is the only way to really solve the problems that we're seeing. Because without that, we will be back to square one at some point.
Giles, I think the way that both Yasmeen and Ravi has laid it out, one I think is not only accurate, but it seems to me is pointing to something that is changing very rapidly, which is that there is now a growing consensus, even among those countries and those leaders who were very much in the camp of Hamas started this war. Israel has a right to defend itself, to say this is a crisis that didn't need to happen, and there's only really one party in some ways to blame. Although Hamas is continuing to fighting, Hamas is not is rejecting a ceasefire under the terms that the U.S. and others are promoting. But still, there's a shift, it seems to me, internationally, that even in the United States, but around the world, where countries were more willing to give Israel the right and support Israel's right of self-defense. Modi, the Indian Prime Minister, has just come out with some serious statements himself on this. That there's this shift internationally where Israel really is not only losing the people that they lost from the very beginning, but it's losing the people that were with it at the start. Is that right? Is that how you see it?
Yeah, no question that shift has happened. It's happened in London as well, where both main parties, which were very careful in the first 4 months, say, since October 7th, to defend all those rights that Israel has to self-defense, self-determination, have changed their rhetoric in debates which are ongoing regularly in the House of Commons. The Labour Party in particular are about to take power here whenever they call an election, very anxious not to be seen to be harbouring what was a sort of anti-Semitic poison, and therefore very anxious to be seen to be supporting the Israeli cause even more strongly than the Conservatives. They are now calling for a ceasefire, an immediate ceasefire. But that shift, the key point surely is that shift has not taken place within Israel's war cabinet. So the difficulty is, and I take all the points that have been made already, but the difficulty is that Netanyahu himself remains in charge and does not believe in a two-state solution, and is holding out for something that he can claim as victory. He set himself the war goal of eliminating Hamas. It is thought that Hamas's military leaders and about perhaps a quarter of its fighting battalions are still active or at least at large in southern Gaza around Rafah. Hence the conditions that we all agree have been created for famine, on which I think it's a useful but also devastating proxy, these truck numbers. We've been trying to visualize it for our readers. 500 a day before October 7th. Since then, a maximum of about 150, but of course for months after October 7th, many fewer than that. And if you take them as a proxy for calories that the 2 million plus people left there need, it was only a matter of time that people started dying. And the only other point I'd add is dying of starvation. But the only other point I'd add is that what follows from that, of course, is accelerating deaths and accelerating humanitarian catastrophe from disease as well.
Yasmeen, I want to come back to you because you're the one who's spent so much time talking to folks in Washington, in the White House, about this, and you've been reporting on the shift that has been taking place in thinking. It strikes me there's a lot of attention on the differences between the Biden administration and the Israeli war cabinet on the question of Rafah and whether they should go in there. But maybe that's the shift is actually taking place on the question, should we have a ceasefire now? because of the dire circumstances. And so, talk a little bit about what that debate is inside, and how do you think it will resolve itself? Because certainly the rhetoric between Biden and Bibi has gone to a point where you wonder whether at some point the U.S. isn't willing to say, no, enough is enough. We're not going to support any continued fighting, period, and do what Ravi and others have been saying. We're going to go for a ceasefire, and that's what it is.
I don't think the administration is at the point where they would call for a full ceasefire, even though this is really hurting Biden politically. I mean, one thing I've really been struck by is when we were talking about this war, when it started in October, and even as it dragged into November and December, the White House, the campaign, allies of the administration were still sort of convinced. And if you remember in December, Blinken and others were being very public about the fact that they wanted this wrapped up in January. I remember someone saying back in October, the idea that this would go on 6 months was just not possible and kind of unfathomable. And that, there was this optimism that it wouldn't hurt Biden politically because it would be over early enough, that it would be far away enough from the election. But I think we're now looking at a scenario where this is almost certainly going to drag through the summer, if not later, because one thing that really struck me this week was when I was talking to administration officials, it was the most resigned and frustrated and uncertain I've heard them be about where we go from here, because there's not a lot of hope anymore for the 6-week ceasefire that the administration was trying to negotiate. They're obviously still working on it, but they did not sound at all optimistic about the prospects for it anytime soon. And Israel and Hamas are so far apart on what they're willing to accept in that deal that I don't think there's a lot of understanding of how you even start to bridge that gap. And on the Rafah operation, the Biden administration's position is not super clear on this, I don't think, because, Biden said in the MSNBC interview, an invasion of Rafah would be a red line if Israel did it without a credible plan to protect the 1.5 million Palestinians living there. And he said, you can't have another 30,000 Palestinians killed. But he wasn't drawing a red line on a Rafah invasion. And administration officials have been very clear, both in public and private, that that's not a red line. They do expect Israel to still go into Rafah at some point. They don't think it'll be in the next couple weeks because they don't have a plan and are not ready. But, they say they need to destroy the last Hamas battalions that are there. And I don't think the U.S. is trying to talk them out of going into Rafah at all, despite how unpopular that invasion would be here. There's a lot of support for it in Israel, and that's what they feel that they are up against. That they say this is not just Netanyahu. Benny Gantz, when he was here, basically said he wanted to go into Rafah yesterday, and there is wide support among the Israeli public to go in and take out the last Hamas battalions. But the problem is there is not really a serious way to move or to protect the Palestinians who are living there. There is virtually nowhere left in Gaza that people can actually live. Like, you can't return people to the north because there aren't many homes left. And of course, we talked earlier about the chaos that has just descended in the north. So, Israel has said, we're going to move people to the middle, or they've sort of started to talk about how they might move people, but these aren't really credible plans. The U.S. has said they have not seen a real plan for Rafah, but what I was struck by in talking to various officials in the administration is they really did not know where they were going to go from here. And there have been these reports that they would condition aid, but those aren't that serious. The administration privately has said, if Israel goes in and kills 10 or 20,000 people, yeah, sure, maybe we'd consider conditioning aid, but we're not talking about it seriously right now. So I know I haven't given a very satisfying answer, but I'm just reflecting what I have seen to be the conversations at this moment.
Yeah, no, I think that strikes me as accurately reporting on what's actually going on, which is the administration is in the same bind it has found itself since day one, which is, if you're going to support Israel's right to defend itself by making sure that Hamas will never be able to launch its attack that it did on October 7th, on the one hand, and on the other hand, trying to do it in a way that helps, that doesn't hurt the people of Gaza. It's hard to do when the target is completely interlocked with the civilian population. In fact, lives underneath it. at times, and it just shows that you can't do these kinds of operations unless you have thought through how you're going to deal with the civilian population, and that was clear from day one. That frankly the Israelis didn't, and not sure they cared all that much, and that the Rafah that when the Rafah action will happen, I'm not sure it's going to make that much difference from what it was in North Gaza or any other place that it was before. So it's a sad commentary on where we are, unfortunately, stuck as we have been for weeks discussing this in a reality that is hard to comprehend, which may be, Ravi, a good time to switch over to another reality that is perhaps even more incomprehensible to understand, which is what's happening in Haiti, where they're talking about a lack of law and order and a lack of governance. Haiti is probably the example number one, in which you have marauding teenagers running around with guns, shooting at will, and getting people out of prison and doing whatever they want without any government being able to protect the people. Bring us up to date where we are in this crisis that seemed to have exploded quite suddenly in some ways in the last few weeks, and what the international community is trying to do to help the people.
So it did explode all of a sudden, but really, for people who followed Haiti for a while, this should not be a surprise. I mean, you talked about a lack of governance, and really, I mean, that is what this is. When you don't have an elected government that people believe in, when you don't have elected officials, and the ones you have are incredibly unpopular, this is kind of what you get. And so, as with any crisis all over the world, a lot depends on how far back you go to look at where history begins. And there are many points that you could find in recent Haitian history of where the chaos began. But, were you to pick 2019, for example, that is the year the United Nations finished up 15 years of peacekeeping operations in the country. And, they had about 10,000 aid organizations that were channeling foreign aid into Haiti and helping to build and support its social services. But when those groups withdrew because of the UN's withdrawal there, basically we kicked off a cycle of social unrest. We kicked off a cycle of chaos. The other point to keep in mind is 2021. President Jovenel Moise was assassinated. Still unclear how that happened. Haitians say that it was foreign mercenaries who were responsible for killing him. But what happened there at that point was Prime Minister Ariel Henry assumes leadership of the country, does not put in place a roadmap to new elections, complete lack of legitimacy. He's unpopular. And then fast forward to the present day, where he decides to leave Haiti to go to Kenya to rally support for a UN-backed international police force. And it is at that moment that the gangs of Haiti, which had begun to take control of Port-au-Prince, they seemed to all unite. They took advantage of the moment where the prime minister was out of the country. And then chaos rules. They essentially staged a giant prison break, freeing, more than 4,000 prisoners. They sort of joined forces to basically take control of all parts of the state apparatus, so much so that the prime minister wasn't even able to come back. He tried to come back to the Dominican Republic, which shares the Caribbean island of Hispaniola with Haiti, but the DR denied his plane permission to land, so he's stuck in Puerto Rico. It's really chaos. And amid all of this, we have debates and discussions in the Caribbean, in Kenya, and in the United States to try and form a coalition to think about, a transitional government that might be able to have some legitimacy, to think about how to get aid into Haiti. Remember, like Gaza, When you don't have any governance structures, all kinds of things go wrong, from the supply of food and water to the running of basic social services and hospitals, policing. All of that is up for grabs right now, as you said, with teenagers essentially who don't have jobs, they need money, and they have access to guns, and they're running amok all over the country. So amid all of that, I think one thing for the international community to keep in mind is, just understanding what it is they're dealing with. Is this just gang violence, or is this an insurgency? And it may be at the point now where it would be more accurate to call this a full-blown insurgency, which can't really just be solved by Kenya, for example, sending over 1,000 policemen, as was originally being discussed by the Kenyans. This might need a lot more. You might need troops on the ground, a bigger peacekeeping force, maybe the United Nations involved once again in a very heavy way to first quell the violence. Negotiating with these gangs is not going to be very fruitful. So quelling the violence and then putting in place a plan that would lead to the legitimate election of leaders who could plausibly lead this country into some semblance of credibility.
Giles, I think Ravi lays out both the recent history and the current situation extraordinarily well. I think one of the challenges that Haiti has is they've tried everything else. They've tried a heavy intervention. They've had outside. You have the United States troops who have been there. The French have been there. The United Nations has been there. Everybody's been there. And the last 25 years is one sort of long history of outside intervention, inability to create lasting governance, and crisis leading to more outside intervention or new, etc. Is there a way to break out of this doom loop, which I think the country is in? I hear people saying, "Well, we need to help the Haitians govern themselves." In some ways, the international community has been trying to do that, but maybe they've been doing it in the wrong way.
I have no doubt that they've been doing it in the wrong way. Yes, there is a way to break out of the doom loop in principle, which is, forgive me for sounding like NGO cliche monger, free and fair elections by which the Haitian people choose their own leaders. That's in principle. But in practice, it just hasn't worked. Ravi is absolutely right that you can pick up the historical roots of this crisis at pretty much any point. I would pick them up in January 2010 when, along with plane loads of other reporters, I had to go down there and cover the earthquake. And I remember that the entire government infrastructure, including the central government buildings in Port-au-Prince, were destroyed and uninhabitable. But even before that, the de facto government of Haiti was the UN compound, which I think it had a long acronym. I think it was MINUSTA. And obviously after the earthquake, in which between 80 and 200,000 people died, that was even more critically important and was coordinating relief efforts, which included huge numbers of planes pouring in and official planes carrying, amongst others, Hillary Clinton, the then Secretary of State, who undertook in very, very solemn language, backed up, as we'll all recall, by Sean Penn and a whole generation of celebrities and concerned people saying, we're really going to sort it this time. We are going to provide the funds to rebuild this country and to rebuild its civil society, to do whatever it takes to get those free and fair elections. They've never happened. The prime minister who's just resigned was only ever appointed. The current plan to secure Port-au-Prince with Kenyan police seems doomed. The gangs who are in control of most of the capital do seem to have one coherent demand, and that is leave us alone to do this ourselves. But as Ravi indicates, this is somewhere between mob control and an insurgency. I'd say it's not organized enough to be an insurgency, although it appears that what finally tipped the balance and forced the prime minister to resign was the fact that the gangs coordinated their message and united under, and I don't claim to have known much about this guy for long, but Jimmy Cherizier and Guy Philippe. We have yet to see whether these two former police officers who seem to control a good deal of Port-au-Prince now end up becoming legitimate candidates for elected office. I rather doubt it. One of them, of course, has served time for laundering drug money in the US. But if our theme today is failures of governance, well, Haiti was always going to be the poster child, I'm afraid.
Yasmeen, I can just imagine that the president sitting in the Oval Office, completely consumed by Ukraine, Gaza, re-election, himself, and so many other things. The last thing they wanted was a crisis like Haiti, which for the U.S., one isn't just close and important, but where are Haitians going to go if they leave Haiti? They come to the United States, usually in large numbers. And in fact, I think one of the reasons Hillary Clinton said what she said in 2010 is she remembers what happened in the early 1990s when Haitians were coming on boats in large numbers to the United States, just as the Clinton administration was coming to power. So this is a very direct national interest for the United States, and so I wonder. How is the White House reacting? How is the U.S. Debating this issue? Given we've been here before, we've tried everything, none of it works, and even promising that we would do everything we possibly can is going to be hard because there's a Congress that is even willing to fund a police mission, let alone anything else.
Well, I mean, I would just note that this anticipation of a large number of Haitian migrants, that I'm sure a large number would come into Florida, comes against this backdrop of Biden already grappling with an immigration issue. And Biden recently has taken this much, much tougher line, one that has made a lot of Democrats uncomfortable when he's talking about the border and who can come in and stricter measures around political asylum. I think that would be very different in the case of Haitian migrants. Blinken was in Jamaica this week and expressed support for this transitional body to help sort of get back to a stable political climate for Haiti, whatever that sort of means in the big picture. But I think the president, is grappling with maybe his worst foreign policy year in the year he's also seeking re-election, which, you have this crisis in Haiti and what it would mean for the U.S. domestically. And I also would just note, not to make this too political, because this is obviously a humanitarian disaster as well, but large numbers of Haitians coming into Florida could be disastrous with Ron DeSantis there and the way he's been busing migrants and just making people coming into Florida like a political tool and political cudgel against Democrats and Biden. And so then they would have to grapple with all of that. And then on top of that, he's consumed by Israel, which we were talking about earlier, has no end in sight. My colleagues had a really good story about Ukraine today, about how Biden officials anticipate Russia taking back significant territory and the war just going, large numbers of Ukrainian casualties if they're not able to get this money from Congress. So, I mean, they are up against already a sort of disastrous foreign policy year, already a pretty bad immigration system that can't handle the migrants that are coming in, let alone another flood of migrants from another country. And like you said, Ibu, a Congress that has shown an unwillingness to do pretty much anything right now. Even though there's bipartisan support for this national security supplemental, it hasn't been moving anywhere. So I just think it would be extremely unlikely that you could mobilize Congress, particularly the House, which is controlled very narrowly right now by Republicans, to address the crisis in Haiti or to address an influx of Haitian migrants in a serious way.
So that sort of leaves me, Giles, actually a nice transition to elections in Russia. And I put elections in quotation marks because part of Putin's argument for why he needs to be in charge is because look at what happens when you have these Western liberal kind of ideas, governance falls apart, chaos reigns, and you need a strong leader of a strong state. And that's what I, Vladimir Putin, have given you in the last 24 years since I've been ruling. I will give you for the rest of my life, at least for the next 6 years, if you reelect me. So put the election campaign again in quotation marks that is unfolded in Russia, but really, how does Putin use this in order to, in some ways, strengthen his control not over Russia, but also his control over the Russian people, who seem to be, by and large, supportive of him, and we won't look at the results, but if you look at opinion polls, he might even win a free and fair election.
I have almost no doubt that he would. 3 days of voting, only one conceivable result. No change in that respect since 2020, when, if you'll forgive one more recollection, I remember watching him campaign in April 2020 on a trip to Kazan, east of Moscow. And all we saw of him was one little lonely man in a people carrier, didn't even have tinted windows, driving into town for a brief visit from the airport and then back to Moscow. That was the sum total of his campaigning. At that time, he had been the fifth Russian prime minister in 3 years. He was then appointed acting president, and was made a full-time president by a process of acclamation, which is about to be repeated over 3 days. But the question now is, why on earth does it matter, given, as you say, that there's no debate about the outcome? And I think a key date, a key occasion that helps understand it is the Kremlin Palace. I think it was in late 2014, after the annexation of Crimea, when he, with no regard for international niceties or norms, welcomed Crimea and the Donbass back, in his view, into the Russian Federation. I forget that as provinces X+1 and X+2. And the ripple of applause built to a roar, and it was really alarming as an outsider, but you could see useful for Putin, who at that point had already twisted the constitution to give himself a third term starting in 2012. But I think also addictive to Putin as a sort of an autocrat in learning. And this process of acclamation, which is what the election is, seems like a farce to us outsiders, the product of a couple of decades of propaganda. But for him, propaganda works. They talk about their managed democracy, but they really mean it. I mean, it seems absurd to us for his spokesman to say we have the best democracy, which he did a couple of days ago. But they regard it as the functioning type of democracy. And to your point earlier, Ivo, he likes to mock failures of governance, not just in failed states, but in Western democracies as well. And I think the reason that this is a serious story, regardless of the lack of doubt about the outcome, is we have to wonder what's next. The first point to look out for, obviously, is Sunday at noon, when Alexei Navalny, before his death, had urged voters to show up at noon to show their disapproval of the options presented to them. The options, by the way, there are some other names on the list besides Putin, but that's they are only the loyal or structural opposition. Any real oppositionists have been barred from running or are in jail or dead. And it will be interesting to see if any more people make that sort of low intensity demonstration on Sunday at noon than showed up in Moscow for his funeral. Significant numbers, given the significant risk, but nothing like the tens of thousands who demanded democracy in Ukraine. And then, very briefly, the question is, what will he do with with 6 more years. The signs are that militarily he will test to destruction the war economy that he's built, which is actually, I mean, it's overheating. If you're an economist, there are plenty of signs that inflation will get the better of employers soon. But for now, if you are an average Russian worker, you're looking at wage rises, and you're almost completely insulated by the propaganda machine from the reality of the war. And Putin, assessing the evidence of the last 2 years, seems to be thinking, I'm winning. And just as Yasmeen was reflecting from the opinions reported in the Washington Post from the US administration, I could go on winning and reverse the reversals of early 22 and take a lot more territory. But then there's the social point as well. We now refer quite casually to him as a dictator and Russia as a dictatorship. But let's remember that there's a long way still to go to a sort of neo-Stalinist state. Unfortunately, there's a lot more repressing that he could do. Russians can still travel to Dubai and Turkey. They can still pretend to vote. They can still stream Netflix. Well, I'm not absolutely sure about that, probably Russian equivalents. But, if he wants to go full North Korea, there's a lot of, he can get busy over the next 6 years. So the outlook, unfortunately, is not pretty. But the fact that the Putin project could go so much further in the wrong direction makes this election a story, even though the outcome is not in doubt.
Yeah, no, I think that certainly is a story, and it's Ravi. It strikes me. I want to get your take on the election and whatever, and I think all the really excellent points that Giles made. But also, if think about what we have been talking about here, which is it's about governance. And here you have a country where a person is controlling what is happening in the country with an iron fist. And people seem to be okay with it, at least for now. And it does raise the question, is what people want most? Is it freedom to choose elections, which is what we always tend to think? Or is it actually, in the case of people in Haiti, and security, and the people of Gaza, food, and the people in Russia, stability? And that governance, however it's brought, if that means you get the vote and it doesn't mean anything, they're okay with that.
Yeah, I mean, look, ultimately, I think people want it all, right? They want stability, they want good governance, and they want to pick who gets to administer good governance and security. But you don't always get all of those things. I think this election is really important because it shows to us how much Putin values the fig leaf of democracy, the veneer of legitimacy that it gives him. He is looking for numbers, a big win. Doesn't need it, by the way. I mean, we know that he is a repressive leader who can jail opposition leaders, who can kill them, who can tweak and change the vote if needed, especially where there's electronic balloting. There's a lot that he could do to get the numbers he wants. But at some level, what this election tells us is he cares. He wants to be liked. He wants people to vote for him. He wants people to choose him, whether that is through pressure or through him deploying the dark arts of propaganda manipulation, which he's now mastered over the course of 2 to 3 decades. But make no mistake, this election matters to him because it will allow him to justify and double down on the war in Ukraine. If he is able to sell a big mandate internally, but more importantly to the world, he will be able to say that this is actually what the people want. They want what I am doing. They believe in why I am doing what I'm doing. This is legitimate. So legitimacy is something he has always craved. And that is why he seeks the fig leaf of, electoral democracy, not any semblance of liberal democracy as we think of it in the West, but illiberal democracy. And as Giles says, there's a long way to go between his version of illiberal democracy or, mini dictatorship to go to from there to totalitarianism. And he can exercise those levers if he wanted to. So if the numbers, and I mean, depending on what he reveals, but if the real numbers aren't what he likes, he could respond in all kinds of ways that could be more draconian, that could exert more pressure on the people, that could imprison others who haven't yet been imprisoned. So he has a full range of options available to him. He's crushed dissent when it did come up in the form of Prigozhin and the rebellion that he led. And this is his time for consolidation. And his ability to insulate regular people from what is a wartime economy now and a completely dysfunctional, overheating economy, as Giles pointed out. At some level, he must realize he can't do that forever. Some of these things will catch up with him at some point. We don't know when. But when they do, I think, again, for him to have that fig leaf of democracy, to be able to tell the people, this is what you wanted, is important.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point, that even dictators want to be loved in some ways, or to be seen to be loved. And Yasmeen, just in a couple of seconds that we have left, I wanted to get you in. How does the administration look at this election? And I guess, how are they going to use this as a means to increase the pressure on the House to vote on Ukraine? You mentioned the story in today's Post. There's a growing wariness in the administration about Ukraine's capacity to hold off the Russians. We're really at a very dangerous point. How are they looking at this election as a means to make that argument?
I think they have used every tool they can to make the point that the House needs to pass Ukraine aid. And so with Putin's election, they'll basically say that the threat is still there. He's secured another 6-year term. He's trying to gain legitimacy for his invasion of Ukraine. He's going to use this to be even more aggressive. And he's going to see that the West, the U.S. has looks like it's turned its back on Ukraine, and that's why we need to pass aid now, or else it's not going to just be Ukraine. Then he's going to start moving into other NATO countries. That's the argument they've tried to make, since a lot of Republicans seem to have lost interest in the Ukraine argument. They are now trying to make the point that this is just the start, and with Putin securing another term, you're going to see him try to move into other NATO countries.
Well, if he does, we will be here to take a look at that if and when it happens. But in the meantime, I want to great conversation, depressing, but then that's the state of the world, not the state of the conversation. I think we have shed light on a lot of important issues. Yasmeen Abutaleb of the Washington Post, Ravi Agrawal of the Foreign Policy, and Giles Whittell of Tortoise Media. I want to thank all three of you for joining us today. I want to thank all of you for tuning in. This week, we'll be back next week with another edition of World Review. Until then, have a great weekend.